On February 16th of 2019 at 8 am, Ryan Osman and his girlfriend Jessica McNeil set out from their home in Mesa, Arizona to Utah's Zion National Park. Their plan was to hike the 9-mile-long subway trail, which got its name from a stunning tunnel-shaped canyon. So they began their trek, which included climbing over boulders and fording streams, but halfway through the journey, the sunshine gave way to a light snow. The temperatures were already sinking to about 17 degrees. 3 hours later, they were about 4 miles into the 10-mile hike, and after that they reached the rust-colored walls of the subway trail. There, a small pond stood in their way, with the trail continuing on the other side. Because the pond looked shallow, they began to wade through, with Jessica leading the way, which is when her foot sank into the sandy bottom about 5 feet from the edge. All of a sudden, she fell forward. Both her legs started to sink. Ryan right away began lunging and grabbing her under the shoulders to pull her out of the muck. She scrambled back to shore, but then Ryan started sinking. The water came all the way up to his right thigh and his left calf. He instinctively moved and freed his left leg, but couldn't even budge his right. Jessica handed Ryan a long stick they had picked up earlier in the hike. Ryan jammed it down the side of his leg and tried to wiggle and pull it out, but again, nothing. He was mired in quicksand that was submerged in water. The best way to describe it would be stranding in a huge puddle of concrete that basically dries instantly. Jessica, out of fear, scooped sand with both of her hands, but it was refilling faster than she could pull it out. Ryan said, "Don't bother, you're just wasting your energy." At this point, Ryan was no longer sinking, but he was also not getting out either. He was just stuck in quicksand. They didn't know what to do. They couldn't even call anyone as well, because the only cell reception was back at the trailhead, about 3 to 5 hours away from the rough terrain. Someone has to go back and get help. So since Jessica was safe out of the mud and water, Ryan asked whether she could hide back and call for help, because waiting would only mean him drowning eventually. She didn't want to leave him because she didn't know if she would ever see her boyfriend again. Also, she was scared. She had only ever hiked with Ryan and was very wary of hiking alone on a trail the national park calls very strenuous. But Jessica knew only way to save Ryan's life was to leave him and get help. So she left. Ryan, on the other hand, was also concerned for Jessica. He did not like the idea of her hiking back on the trail all alone, but he just hoped the best for her. About 30 minutes went after that. To make matters worse, it started to snow heavily. Ryan zipped up his jacket and pulled his head inside. At some point, probably due to exhaustion and cold, he nodded off to sleep. He didn't know for how long he was out, but he woke up with his upper body sinking backward into the quicksand. Quickly, he planted his stick into the dry ground to stop the fall. That scared the living hell out of him. He could have died drowning while he was asleep. He was so tired that he didn't even know that his entire body almost fell in. Once he falls, he would never get out. By this point, it had been a little over 5 hours since Jessica left, and it was getting darker and even colder. Then another few hours passed. Ryan saw a very bright light. He prayed it was a helicopter, but it was not. It was just moonlight shining over the canyon walls. His condition was getting worse. He was soaking wet and the cold was getting too much to bear. He knew by this point he was not going to make it. With no hopes, he thought of all the ways that he could die faster. But one thing he really didn't want was to drown by falling backward again. That would be the worst way to go, he thought to himself. Then another hour later, he saw another light. It shone across his eyes. This time it has to be a flashlight, he thought, and just like that, it was a flashlight. He yelled help, and a man from a decent distance yelled back. He ran toward Ryan. He said his name was Tim and that Jessica had gotten through to the rescuers. He was the first rescuer to get to Ryan, as the rest of his crew was about an hour behind. Quickly, in less than an hour, they also arrived. 3 more rescuers. They set up a pulley system to yank Ryan out, tying an anchor strap around a boulder. While 2 rescuers held Ryan under each shoulder, Tim wrapped a strap around his kneecap. Then the 4th rescuer worked the pulley. With each ratchet, it felt as if Ryan's leg was being ripped off. Tim dug into the sand and got a hand around Ryan's ankle and started pulling up. Despite the pain Ryan felt, he screamed, "Keep going." about 3 more ratchets, and his leg was freed. He was then dragged to the side of the canyon by the rescuers as he couldn't walk. In fact, he couldn't even feel his legs. At this point, it was pitch black dark and snowing, so calling in a helicopter was out of the options. So they got Ryan into a sleeping bag and then gave him some pain medication. Because the rescuers were going to spend the night with Ryan, they had no choice, so they settled in for the night. Probably due to pain and exhaustion, Ryan quickly fell asleep, but when he woke up the next morning at about 6 AM, snow had covered the top of his sleeping bag and flakes were still coming down. 4 inches of snow fell in that area that night, but around noon, luckily the weather lifted and the rescuers called in a helicopter. Ryan's entire leg looked pretty bad. It was abnormally swollen to the size of his thigh. He thought he will lose his leg, though once he was taken to the hospital in St. George with x-rays, they found that there were no fractures or breaks. Since he sat in the quicksand in the same position for 12 hours straight, he felt a lot of pain and thought he would die, but he didn't. As a matter of fact, he had a very fast recovery.